At the end of 2019, I crafted my New Year's resolution for the year 2020. My resolution was to make more friends, to go out more, to go to more social gatherings, and overall, to be closer to others. I would soon learn how ironic that resolution was. So I didn't do those things in 2020, but in August of that year, Jenny and I were blessed to buy our first home. And because of the situation, we didn't do the usual things that you do when you buy a new home, to introduce yourself to your new neighbors and to invite them into the new home, to get to know them. We didn't think that was a good idea. So for a little while, we had an excuse not to know our neighbors. But now it's almost 2 years on since then, and things have changed, and yet we really still only know our next door neighbors, even after all this time. We have Vern to the right of us, and we see him when he walks his dog and we walk ours. And then Mark to the left of us. I'll say hello while I'm getting the mail, and he's working in the front yard, and he's kind enough to get our mail for us when we go on vacation. But we really don't know our neighbors very well. And I think that describes a lot of modern Americans, especially those of us who live in the suburbs. What's ironic is that neighbor and stranger really are opposites. They're supposed to mean the opposite, but for a lot of us, our neighbors are strangers to us. And so is someone our neighbor if they live close to us, but we don't really know them? Who is my neighbor? This is the question that prompts one of Jesus' most well-known parables, that of the Good Samaritan. A lawyer, that is, an expert in the Jewish law, stands up to test Jesus and asks him, "Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus answers with a question. Well, what do you read in the law? What do you see there? And he says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength." That's from Deuteronomy. "And you shall love your neighbor as yourself." That's from Leviticus. And so these two commandments sum up the entire Torah. Love God, love your neighbor. And he passes the test. Jesus says, that's correct. Do that and you will live. But there is an ambiguity in at least the second part of that answer. To love the Lord your God is clear enough. There's only one God. It's obvious what it means to love him. But to love your neighbor, who qualifies as your neighbor? Depending on how expansive or restrictive your definition of a neighbor is, you could either be fulfilling that commandment perfectly or failing at it miserably, depending on how expansively you define it. For example, if only those who belong to your religion or your group of people, your race, if only they are your neighbors, then everyone who is, in this context, a non-Jew would not be a neighbor, and therefore you would not be obligated to love them. Or some might even take it further. I think of the parable of the Pharisee and the publican. For that Pharisee, perhaps even being a fellow Jew was not enough to be a neighbor. Perhaps you needed to be a righteous person, so only the righteous are my neighbors, even if they are of my race. So who counts as someone's neighbor? And as usual, Jesus does not give a straightforward answer, but rather a parable. He says, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers. This road from Jerusalem to Jericho has been called the Way of Blood because of how often ambushes were on this way. Martin Luther King Jr. mentioned this road in the last sermon he ever preached, "I've Been to the Mountaintop," which was delivered a day before he was assassinated. He said, "I remember when Mrs. King and I were first in Jerusalem. We rented a car and drove from Jerusalem down to Jericho. As soon as we got on that road, I said to my wife, I can see why Jesus used this as the setting for his parable. It's a winding, meandering road. It's really conducive for ambushing. You start out in Jerusalem, which is about 1,200 feet above sea level, and by the time you get down to Jericho, you're about 2,200 feet below sea level. That's a dangerous road." So the man is making this trip. He's ambushed, he's stripped of his clothes, beaten, and left half dead. And by chance, Jesus says, a priest is passing by, but leaves the man. Now, homilists often say that in the parable, the priest didn't want to be ritually defiled, right? He thought it was a dead body, and he didn't want to touch the dead body because that would make him ritually impure. But we're not really given the reasons why he passes by. Of course, the story is fictional. It didn't really happen. But if it did happen, I can think of a number of reasons someone would pass by. Maybe they were afraid for their own life. Maybe they didn't want to be ambushed. And they thought, well, if I have to attend to this person, whether they're alive or dead, that will take more time, and maybe it will put me in danger. Oh, it's a dead body, I'll just pass by. But whatever the reason was, the priest and the Levite did not stop to check to see whether the man was still alive. And if he was dead, the merciful thing would be to bury him. And if he was still alive, the merciful thing would be to try to save him. But they didn't. But then a third passerby arrives on the scene, the Samaritan. Those who lived in Samaria were not Jews, but they weren't quite pagans either. They worshiped the God of Israel, but they had different traditions. And they spurned the temple in Jerusalem and worshipped instead on Mount Gerizim. The Samaritans thought that they were the true inheritors of the traditions of Moses. And so they were just similar enough to Jews for it to breed contempt. And many Jews hated Samaritans. And the feeling was mutual. Remember in our gospel reading a few weeks back, the Samaritans did not receive Jesus because he was heading on to Jerusalem. They did not want to provide hospitality to him. And then the sons of thunder asked, well, should we call down heaven fire and consume them? And Jesus rebukes them. But despite the antipathy between these two groups of people, the Samaritan sees the half-dead man and he's moved with pity. He acts decisively and pours oil and wine on the man's wound and bandages them up. He puts him on his mule and takes him to an inn and takes care of him. If the Samaritan had used the logic that only the people who belonged to his people, his religion, his race, were his neighbors, if he had used that logic, then he wouldn't have needed to stop. The half-dead man in the road would not have been his neighbor, and so he would not have been obligated to love him and to rescue him. Instead, he saves him, and the other two passersby who belonged to the same race and religion as the man in the parable were the ones who passed him by. And so the climax of the parable is when Jesus says, which of these three do you think were a neighbor to the man? And the lawyer says, the one who treated him with mercy. So the message of the parable is that my neighbor is not simply the person who lives close to me, not simply the person who belongs to my religion or my race or my group of people. My neighbor isn't simply someone that I have a lot in common with, but my neighbor is the one who shows me mercy, irrespective of our differences. And I am a neighbor to someone if I show them mercy. As the Lord said, go and do likewise. So the real answer to the lawyer's question, who is my neighbor, is potentially everyone. Everyone in my life I can be neighborly toward insofar as I can be merciful to others. Now, maybe not everyone will be a neighbor to me. Maybe not everyone will be merciful to me. And we can't control the actions of others. So maybe not everyone will be a neighbor to us, but we can be a neighbor to others. We can be merciful to everyone who crosses our path. So the practical application when I read this is to think about who is it in my life that would be the Samaritan? Who is it in my life that I would be inclined to not think of as my neighbor? Who is it in your life that you have a hard time thinking of as your neighbor? Who irks you? Who irritates you? Who do you have a feeling of antipathy toward? And try this week, if you interact with that person or that group of people, try to be neighborly toward them. Try to show them mercy. Maybe they won't be very neighborly to you, but for your part, try to be neighborly to them. There's one other interpretation of this parable that is of such antiquity and it's so moving, I would be remiss if I didn't share it with you. It's a more allegorical interpretation of the parable, and we find it in many of the church fathers like Irenaeus and Origen and St. Augustine. And it's meant to complement, not to contradict the more traditional interpretation that we're familiar with. In this interpretation, it is we who are the wounded person, who've been wounded by sins, and it's Jesus who is the Good Samaritan, who takes pity on us and who bandages our wounds, pours oil and wine on them, oil reminding us of the oil that we're anointed with after baptism, and wine symbolic of the Eucharist. And Jesus who bears us up and takes us to the inn, that is, to the church, and entrusts us to the church where we will experience healing until he returns. So this is a different way of reading the parable. Rather than trying to see ourselves as the Good Samaritan who's being merciful to others, we see ourselves as the wounded person. St. John of Damascus has a lovely hymn, a prayer to Christ, and he says, "As the man who fell among thieves and was wounded by them, so I've fallen in my sins, wounded in soul. Who can I turn to for healing except you, physician of souls and bodies? We entreat you, bind up our sinful sores, pour out your mercy on us with your healing care." And so those are two interpretations of the parable that have a very practical significance for our lives. And so to Christ, who is our Good Samaritan, who binds up our wounds and who heals us with his mercy, and who empowers us to be neighborly to everyone in our life, to him be glory now and forever. Amen.